to ask questions. For those of you who have joined us who might be coming from Declarative AI and haven't been on the DecisionCAMP site so far, if you are on our Slack workspace, you can ask questions there. Otherwise, you can just raise your hand on Zoom and James will notice and call on you to ask the question. And that's about it. So take it away, James.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Sandy. So welcome, everybody. Over the years, I've hosted a bunch of panels, and the format we're going to use today has worked well in other panels. So hopefully it will work well today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the panelists to you, and then I'm going to call on them each in turn to tell a story that's relevant to this topic of decisioning and decision management, and then give some do's and don'ts, so sort of some hardcore tips, so that even if you only listen to the beginning of the panel, you'll get some real value. And then we'll take your questions, right? So we're going to use this as a context setting, get everybody warmed up, and get those first few questions lined up, so we've got some material. So with that, let me do introductions. These are going to be in the order they're in my file, so that I'm not sure what order they'll be on your screen. But first, we're joined by Alan Fish. Alan's the Senior Director of Business Enablement for the FICO platform. He previously was the Product Manager for Blaze Advisor, one of business rules management system, and a business analyst on FICO's decision automation projects. Alan's responsible for introducing decision requirements diagrams, certainly to me, back in 2012, and he is currently, for undefined sins in his past lives, the co-chair and editor for the DMN standards. Gary Hallmark is business automation architect for Oracle, researching next generation cloud native infrastructure for the Oracle applications. Previously architected the decision modeling and business rules components of the Oracle Process Cloud service. He was co-chair of the DMN Standards Committee for many years, but clearly has managed to find an escape clause because he's no longer in that somewhat difficult role. Carlos Serrano-Morales is the CTO, co-founder of Sparkling Logic. He's responsible for their Smarts decision platform. Previously, the VP responsible for FICO's Blaze Advisor and other decision management products, going all the way back to the expert system, right, Carlos, if I remember correctly. Guilhem Molines is the Decision Chief Architect and Senior Technical Staff member at IBM, working on their suite of decisioning products. Previously, the architect for IBM Operational Decision Manager and the iLog JRules product, and recently worked on the navigation system of the Mayflower autonomous ship, which is currently visible behind him, and I think he's already presented on. And then finally, last but not least, Bob Moore. Bob started work on automated decision systems back in 1989, probably before some of you were out of school, and spent the following 3 decades or so building rules-based systems for a wide range of clients. He's largely retired now, lucky bastard, but has recently got himself involved in educating the next generation of IT professionals at the Open University there in England. All right, so that's the panel. Tremendous array of expertise, frankly, decades of experience building the stuff that everybody uses here. So I'm going to ask them to tell their stories, and I know more or less what story they're going to tell. So the order is deliberate. So Guilhem, you get to go first. Why don't you tell us a little story about decision?
Yeah, so you were asking about a scary story, right? So
yeah,
maybe I think they're most interesting. So maybe the one about this customer who shall rename nameless, and maybe they would be embarrassed that their name be spread. But we had this customer a few years back that wrote a series of rules for which the conditions were limited to 1 or 2 tests, mostly feature flag. And the action part were hundreds of lines of statements, literally. And that reminds me, I mean, the first session we had a DecisionCAMP this year from Dennis about low code and no code, it clicked, right? Well, these guys were actually doing programming. They use the action part of rules with a series of statements to write programs. And the only reason they did so is because it was a way for them to channel behavioral changes to the system without going through all the pipeline of approval. They had in this company, there was a lot of red tape before you could roll out code into production. So they found this as an easy way, because rules are text and text is not part of the program, obviously, at least from their standpoint. They could just roll out changes to production fairly quickly without having to go through all the approval process and all the red tape within the company. And they use rules in this fashion just to write a series of statements to change the behavior of the system, with the condition part being just feature flag, basically. And the only reason that I heard about it was because obviously somewhere down the line it broke, and they raised tickets to the support to ask questions. And that's when we uncovered the truth of how the system was used in such a way. Crazy, terrible, but in a way, I mean, I could understand the logic, even though it was.
So the moral of the story would be, if you're going to buy a decision engine, use it to like automate decisions. Don't use it as a way around your CI/CD pipeline.
Yeah, it was a way for them to just avoid the actual software lifecycle processes. So very scary.
Yeah. All right, Bob. I think you have another scary story here.
Well, it's not exactly a scary story, but the story is basically that about 10 years ago, I was sent out to New York to help build an onboarding system for an investment bank, and we were going to be using Oracle's BPM tool. I can't actually remember who it was who Oracle had just bought up to get a BPM tool, but there were basically between 8 and 10 of us who were sort of stuffed into this windowless room on the 10th floor of some large Manhattan building, and sort of basically told, build something. It's got to be working. By we had I think a deadline of 3 months to get this thing up and running, and we worked away and we beavered away, and we actually managed to get something up and running within the time limit, and which was all amazing. But we ran into all sorts of problems immediately afterwards when people started to sort of say, well, we'd like to do something else, because our BPM diagrams were spaghetti. I mean, there was no kind of, the decisioning was in reams and reams of Java, literally hundreds of lines of this stuff. And the whole thing had kind of been, because we'd basically been sort of obliged through this kind of hothouse mechanism to produce something so that the client's project manager could get funding for the next stage of proceedings. We had made all the sorts of we produced a monster, which was then we were supposed to somehow kind of manipulate into something which could then be evolve in time and actually be something useful with fuller functionality. And all of the decisioning had been embedded in sort of action action statements in the BPM diagram, and it was kind of both a success and a disaster at the same time. And the thing was that when I actually had time to sit down and sort of really cogitate about what it was that the business was trying to do, I went to the project manager and said, well, look, why aren't we using, the client actually has ODM, they bought that up. We should be using that to do all of this. And we can simplify the BPM diagrams, and we can actually build the logic. And what's more, the business will actually be able to see that we're doing the right thing. And his response to this was, I think you're right, Bob, but unfortunately, I've pinned my sort of promotion on us using BPM. And it is I think a sort of one of the sorts of stories which I think is also one of the sorts that was related on the Slack channel, where there is not only a sort of not invented here sort of mentality with some people, but the thing is that they actually don't want to go down that route because it has effects on their own personal development plans, and that the strategy, you run into a sort of issues about strategy. And I think that that's probably something which is the case for anybody who is trying to sell any kind of software tool. If you come to somebody who's actually kind of got their own personal agenda which goes off in a different direction, then you're not necessarily going to be able to give the client actually the best solution.
Right.
But the same story actually has happened to me a couple of times since then. So I worked on a project in Holland where, again, we were building this BPM solution, and I sort of came in actually after the thing had been going for about 4 or 5 months, and I thought that the spaghetti that we'd had when we developed it from scratch was bad, but this was even worse. I mean, it was sort of, you looked at the top level process, and it was, I don't know, sort of about 40 or 50 boxes, and then when you dug into those, some of those were sub processes, and they were just as bad. And
Right.
it was almost like, you know, they were encoding if statements in in branches in the process. And another project which I did a while ago was doing something very similar, where
so don't do that.
It's all rule. It's all rule based. I mean, it's all
Right.
decisions, but they're trying to use BPM and BPMN as a way of encoding that. And unless it's something that's very simple, it becomes unbelievably complicated from a diagrammatic perspective.
Yeah, very quick. All right. I'm gonna have to cut you off, Bob, because we
yeah, sure.
Get to. So all right, so yes, absolutely. It's just like, you know, and to be fair, I've seen people use a BRMS to try and do process flow too, right? So it's just, you know, you can get yourself, use the right tool for the right job. Alan, you're up next. A slightly more optimistic story, if I remember.
Oh, okay. Right.
A little bit more optimistic.
Here's probably my favorite project when I was working as a business analyst, and it wasn't just because it was in Cape Town. It was just it was a lovely a lovely problem from MedScheme to health care scheme administration. So we've talked about medical claims assessment and so on, horrifically complicated domain, and they're a scheme administrator. So it's not even just as if they're a single insurer or a single provider. They have to manage the rules for many different providers and insurers and see how those interact. Anyway, so I did one project on claims handling, and then they called me back to do one on claims authorization. So this is rather different, where you're in advance of treatment. The patients have to call the administrator and say, I need to have these treatments done, can you authorize them? So you've got this structure of decisions on a number of levels. You've got decisions about the diagnoses, and we talked about ICD codes earlier, so you've got that database. You've got decisions about the procedures to be carried out, so you have procedure codes, the similar weight of data, and products that might be used. You've got product codes, and then you've got a level above those three domains. You've got decisions about the treatment, and the auth that's being requested is for a number of treatments covering a number of diagnoses for a number of procedures and products in those treatments. So it's a pretty hairy bit of analysis, but very interesting. We've got it all sorted out. And then they called me back a couple of months later.
Oh dear, you had to go to Cape Town again.
I did, yes, it's a dreadful shame. And we've got a bit of an issue with what actually is probably the core decision in the whole thing, which is what they call LOC-LOS, which stands for level of care and length of stay. In other words, it's what actually you get authorized is a number of periods in a hospital. So you might have a day in pre-op, a day in ICU for the operation, 2 days in high care, and 4 days on the general ward or something like that. And the level of care you get and the length of stay you need is determined by the reason for admission, which is decided from the various diagnoses and things that got you admitted to hospital in the first place. And I said, well, we worked all that out. I thought that was fine. We got all the reference data for how to decide what level of care you need, these various conditions and so on. They said, well, what we're not sure is what we do when the reason for admission changes. I said, well, how can the reason for admission change? And I said, well, if someone's in hospital and they have an operation, there's some complication, then they need different treatment, and that requires different level of care and level of stay, which means they need a new reason for admission. No, they were admitted for a certain reason. That can't change. So we had to unpick all of this. And Ron would appreciate this, because it's a matter of definition as to what reason for admission actually means. And I had to just assumed it was actually the reason for admission. But
funny that
they think of it as something that can change over time. So we had to change the whole thing so that level of care and level of stay was determined directly by the various treatments and so on that were being carried out. Anyway, that's quite a salutary tale of understand something when you actually don't.
Yes, statelessness and clarity are both important in these circumstances. All right, Gary, you get to go next. We're going to leave Carlos till the very end.
Okay, in the form of a story, right? Okay, so once upon a time, a product manager, actually from Oracle's process automation service, had a customer question that he couldn't answer. And by the way, process automation service, or Oracle OPA, Oracle Process Automation, is the new home for our DMN, BPMN, and CMMN wares in the Oracle Cloud. Anyway, the customer was stuck generating some good reasons, explanations for his financial decisions. And well, that kind of got my attention, because the project manager already knew the basics. You know, you have to use a multiple output decision table, and you can't really use the annotation columns because they don't actually get output anywhere. They're just comments, right? And so I asked for the details. I was actually surprised to receive the DMN Chapter 11 example, right, which has been around forever, along with the explanation that, you know, if you can show some good explanations for, say, the routing decision, we can take it from there. So, you know, there's the first don't, right? Never underestimate the power of a good example, or the reach of a good example in this case, right?
The things people will do with it, right? Yeah.
I mean, I'm looking at this example for probably, you know, the 1000th time, right? But this time from the perspective of generating good explanations for the decisions. And I begin to see the customer's problem, right? So for example, if you're declining the loan because of a recent bankruptcy, that sounds reasonable. But declining it because, you know, our system has determined that you can't afford it isn't so satisfying, probably, for the customer, right? Maybe even pejorative. And so digging into this, right, sub-decisions have to be refactored in the Chapter 11 example to also return reasons, right? And the parent decisions have to be refactored to combine the sub-explanations into a final explanation. And so if you look at the affordability decision, you know, you might need to know whether the new payment is really more than your disposable income, or whether you're in a high risk category and there's such a high pad that that's what's causing the problem, right? And then, you know, continuing to unravel the sweater here, right? You know, let's say that you do have a high risk category. Where does that come from, right? What are the primary contributors to the high risk score? Well, you know, the summation decision tables don't actually work very well, or don't work at all if you add a reason column, right? Because while you can add the partial scores, you can't actually add the reasons. And so you have to do some fairly significant refactoring of that. And if you look at some of the other decision tables, they have some similar problems, right? So if you have an any hit table, right, that's valid with a single output, if you now add a reason, if that reason isn't actually functionally dependent on the output, in other words, you could have the same output but two different reasons, then it's not an any table anymore.
Yeah,
and we'll actually get validation problems there, right? So, you know, I guess, you know, maybe the next version of the DMN spec, we could actually do even more improvements to the Chapter 11 example and put in some explicit explanations and do some of that refactoring.
And when you said we there, you meant you, right?
Well, you know,
well, you mean Alan, really? I mean, it's just like, you know, let's be honest.
Yeah, it's a community. I'll certainly pitch in and help.
Terrific. All right, Carlos. Excellent. All right, Carlos, tell your story.
Okay, so you asked for a story that would be interesting and challenging.
Yeah.
So I picked one. So the reason, so I picked a story in the insurance world. Insurance is a very boring domain, as you know. But in this case, what was interesting was the level of challenges. So this is an organization, a type of application where there is a lot of variability of the decision logic according to regions and according to time. So, you know, typical federal, state, county, city, and with a lot of changes through time. So we're talking 500,000 rules approximately. So it's a huge, huge system built through time. The key challenges in migrating a system, why would you migrate from there? You know, so that's a key question, since you have already all that investment done. So the key is that they reached the point where there was so much inflexibility in the system and so much difficulty in taking into account the pressures of the business, you know, the speed at which the business needs to move, that they had no choice. So it's combining that with a move to the cloud. The idea was to get out of that inflexibility the fastest way possible. The reason that's again quite boring still. However, you go one level down and you try to analyze why is it that you got to that inflexibility. And there we start seeing a theme which is very common to what everybody else has been saying. So the very first one is that if you don't enable the business analysts with the tools that they need to have in order to express the logic the way they need to express it, they'll find workarounds. And they'll find workarounds means that they're going to take a phone and they're going to call their friend in IT and say, you know, I'm trying to express this, it doesn't work. And the guy's going to say, yeah, you know what, I'm going to do it in the UI layer. Don't worry. Or yeah, I'm going to do it in the database layer. Don't worry. So the end result at the end of the day is that your logic ends up being scattered through multiple environments. Consequences are, of course, very difficult to manage them. You don't know where they are anymore. To go back to Gary's points, you don't even know how to explain them because you don't have a unified view of what that is. The same applies to lifecycle, and that's the other big problem. So when you're in a situation where you have that many rules and you need to deploy so frequently, well, you better have a very strong and very powerful lifecycle management. If lifecycle management is fully owned by IT and only IT can modify it, well, they have other other responsibilities in life than making the analyst happy. So the end result is that ends up being again inflexible, and you go into workarounds, and the workarounds are done by IT itself, basically defeating their own system. So you end up with a mess in deployment. So converting a system like that, so they tried it, with a previous generation of decision management platform. They're trying again, and they're doing it again. The key here in making these changes and what we identified as the key two objectives was not really that much transfer those 500,000 rules. That would be a side effect if you want, of the key effort. The key effort was essentially to make sure that there is in place an approach that would guarantee that the analysts or the people responsible for the decision logic would be responsible for the decision logic from A to Z, from design essentially and to deployment. And the key to that, and maybe you guys are not going to like this, but the key to that is be extremely good at having an excellent environment to do testing. Because at the end of the day,
sure.
You cannot document 500,000 rules in an easy graphical way. And they become out of date very quickly. So the truth is what your system does. So if you're extremely good at understanding outcomes or being able to extract outcomes from existing systems, and the analysts actually also understand that better. They understand data better than understand logic. I mean, that has been an issue that we always raffle. They understand data and they understand logic. So they understand expected outcomes, they understand the input, they understand that if something is working or not based on that. So that's sort of a key focus. And the second focus is the lifecycle management. It's making sure that they can deploy their changes at the city level, the county level, the state level, whenever required, without having all that flexibility, in particular, without having to resort to workarounds.
Yeah, no, testing and simulation are you want them to own the rules. And if they can't test them and simulate the impact, yeah, they'll just ask somebody else.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
what I
exactly
did realize,
I mean,
and what it re-emphasized the fact that, if you only had to choose one, I'm sorry to say this, but if you had to choose only one, being very good at testing or very, very good at capturing requirements, well, that would be my choice.
That would be yours. All right. So we're going to take your questions in a moment. I'm going to ask everyone in a second just to do a quick do and don't. I'm just going to run through those. So we had Guilhem and Bob explaining why it's really important if you buy a decision engine to use it for decisions, and if you have a business process engine, you use it for business processes, and you don't use them for the other problem. We heard from Gary about the importance of thinking about all the ways your model gets used. If you need to explain it, that needs to be part of how you design it. It needs to be part of it, and also how important examples are. Alan's story illustrates both the nature of change in these things and the importance of clarity. Decision models help tremendously in being much clearer than requirements documents, but you still need to be clear what the decisions are that you're talking about. And then Carlos, as these things scale up, pointing out that the life cycle you wrap around it and the way you can test it and understand it matter tremendously the more complex the system becomes. The graphical diagrams can only help so much. You still need a certain amount of framework around it. So some great stories. We all have happy stories too, but scary stories tend to illustrate, don't go under the bridge. There's a troll. It's a long established way of getting people to stay on the bridge. So there are trolls under the bridge. Don't get off the bridge. Okay. So, all right. So before we take your questions, I'm going to ask each of them to give us a quick do and a don't, just to sort of, that you capture some more of their vast expertise, and then we'll get to questions. I see, unsurprisingly, Denis has a question already. So we'll get to your question, Denis. Thank you for going first. It's a tough job, but someone's got to. And we appreciate it. So we'll get to Denny's question and hopefully some others soon. And with that, Bob, quick do and a quick don't, and then we'll go through the list in my secret order.
Okay. Quick do is basically to remember that if you're building a decision system, if it's a piece of software, you still need to remember the good practice of software engineering. Sure. And that means you've got to understand what the requirements are, what the specification is. You have to have some documentation. You have to test it properly. You have to understand what the life cycle is going to be. And as a kind of corollary to that has some impact, I think, in terms of the discussions that we've had about things like low code and enabling the analysts to build the systems themselves. They need to be aware of the things that can go terribly wrong if you don't follow best practice. And I mean, it's the same for any kind of new technology. People can forget these things. That is a sort of my don't is really the kind of flip side of that. Is you have this new piece of cool technology. If you jump in too quickly before you understand how it works and before you think about what you're going to try and use it for, then you will quite quickly get yourself in a muddle, which is exactly what happened with the BPM projects I talked about earlier on.
Yeah. All right. Guilhem, what's about you? Do's, don'ts.
Yeah, so I'm going to echo maybe a little bit of what Carlos said earlier. That is the importance of empowering the business with tools that they can use. And quite often as developers, we tend to have our own models, our own data models. And it's easy to just drop that into the tool and hand over to the business and say, now go ahead and write the rules. Well, guess what? That data model that we have written as developers is probably very good for our usage and probably very bad for rule writing. Yeah. And it lends itself to rules that are just not understandable. So it's quite important to be able to craft a data model whose sole purpose is to support the writing of rules that do make sense for this business with common definition. And I'm thinking about Alan's example of the reason for admission. This is typically the kind of thing where the common sense definition is not mapping with the usage that those people wanted to have of those words. So it's important to have a data model that has been crafted for that reason, for that purpose, and a tool that supports refactoring, because obviously you're not going to get it right on the first go, and you're going to have to iterate and cycle again with all the business analysts that are going to be in charge of maintaining those rules to refine this data model, this vocabulary in such a way that the rule writing makes sense. Mm-hmm. Right. That's number one. I mean, before you even start testing, and Carlos is right, testing is quite important, but before you start testing, you have to agree upon what you're currently writing in terms of statement within the rules, and that can be exchanged among all of the stakeholders in a way that is not ambiguous and makes sense. So to me, if I wanted to say just one thing, it would be that. Have a
Right.
data model match what you want to write in the rules in a lingo that is acceptable for all of the stakeholders in that domain.
All right, Alan.
Okay, so my do, I'm just following on from my story.
Yeah.
My do is that it's okay. We had this model in our heads that we are modeling stateless decisioning, whether it's done by a decision service or whether it's human. It helps in our analysis to imagine that decisioning takes place at a given moment in time and has a given set of information, and we can analyze it as a static piece of logic. But you have to remember that this is often in the context of a process in which things are changing, and we're a process which has a state. And it's especially true if you have a service which is being called multiple times in the process. You need to think about the implications of time. You need to distinguish between permanent decisions and current decisions, and so on. So just to be careful about time, because it can trip you up.
Yeah.
And my don't is don't believe your business experts necessarily, especially when they have. Don't accept their business concepts without question, because terms are often used inconsistently, especially by experts.
Right. Yeah. Make sure you know. It was one of our rules of thumb is we often find that when we're building a decision model and we get disagreement, when we go back and make people read out the actual question and the actual allowed answers for each decision, someone will go, "Oh, I didn't think that's what that decision did." And then we have a conversation. All right, cool. Gary, a do and a don't.
All right, do design your decision model to output cogent reasons along with the business outcomes. The reasons, they're almost always helpful, and increasingly we've seen, they're required, maybe by law, right?
For sure.
Look, machine learning is growing rapidly, in the business automation space, right? Buoyed by their success in smart document scanning, chatbots. Users want easy ML, right, to make their processes smarter. They don't want expensive code or rules. But one way to disrupt that is to ask them, how are you going to explain that? How are you going to explain that decision? Right? Don't wait until the end to do this, right? As I already pointed out, right, in the chapter 11 example that was developed, like 8 years ago or so, right? Probably more, right? Because I think part of it came from your book, Alan. I just showed how in order to retrofit good explanations for, say, the routing decision, you may have to drill quite deeply, right? I've got it on my screen over here. That's why I'm looking. Routing, drilling through the post-bureau affordability down to the post-bureau risk category, and finally to the application risk score, right? You might have to refactor a lot of that in order to get good explanations out.
Yeah, no, it's for sure. And decision models are fundamentally more explicable than machine learning in that sense. So they provide a great framework for it, but you still, as you say, you have to think through it and make sure it happens.
Or figure out a way to do it automatically, That's an interesting topic too.
Yeah. All right, Carlos, your do and your don't, and then we'll take questions from the floor, as they say.
Okay, so just reflecting what I said in the use case, make sure that you do have strong support for the business knowledge from A to Z, essentially including the deployment lifecycle, and with absolute guarantee of trace. So making sure that at any point you can reconstruct the environments, you know exactly what was deployed, what was executing at point X and point Y, and that kind of stuff. The don't is sort of the flip side of the same thing. Don't believe that we're going to get IT out of the picture. So IT will be there. So the key, you need to prove to IT that the processes that you put in place and the support that you put in place for analysts is going to satisfy their requirements. So there is a lot, what I noticed is that there's a lot of product management work that goes into understanding the concerns and requirements from IT so that you're certain that what you build is something that they understand the boundaries of, and they feel confident that that they will to give you control, if you want to give analysts control over that. Those are the two most difficult things, actually. In the end, writing the rules is easy. This part is complicated.
Right. No, it's one of the things we observe often is the number of projects we come across where someone set out and they genuinely wanted to empower their business to maintain the rules, but they said they're going to do that in phase 2. So in phase 1, to Guilhem's point, they're going to take the way IT thinks about all this stuff. We're going to implement that. We'll get it up and running, and then we'll empower the business to do version 2. Well, no, you won't. Yeah, you have to empower the business to build version 1. Otherwise, it's never going to happen. Yeah, so anyway, cool. Thank you, everybody. All right, so we've got some questions from the floor here. I'm going to start with Denise. The first one's a little bit of a polling question, so we'll go in reverse order just to do that one. After that, I'll just let you answer the questions if you're interested. So Denise says, listening to all these improper uses of tools, in a much more general sense, do you think tools should prevent people from creating whatever they want, even if it's, quote, bad? Or should the tool just be a tool and let them build whatever they want and make the mistakes they make and dig themselves into whatever holes they want? What's the duty or the role of a tool in preventing you from doing stupid things, even if that means perhaps that it's hard for you to do something that might be, in one corner case necessary? So we'll do, that seems like we want everyone to answer that. So we'll do that in reverse order. Carlos, why don't you take a stab at that first, then we'll go back up the list.
I'm extremely biased in my answer.
I know you're.
I've been doing tools all my life. So a tool's role is to enable and to get out of the way. So as far as I'm concerned, the tool, there is no, again, in absolute terms, there's no bad usage of a tool. It's all contextual. In this circumstance, you're using it the wrong way, but in this other circumstances, it actually makes sense. And if you do, the challenge is, and it's something that I've fought with all my life. If ever you start putting constraints in the system, you end up with the fact that people will always work around. We'll always find another way, and you created yourself a problem which is an order of magnitude larger than handling it during the product. What I do believe in, though, is that, we all believe in that. Tools have to be extremely reactive to the way they're used, and we have to be able to identify in a misuse of a tool, why was it misused, and see if there is a better way, adding a little bit to the product or guiding them, essentially in doing that. But no, for me, it should be free.
I knew your answer, Carlos, because I remember once famously coming to you with a group of people, and we asked if you would put a feature in the product that would prevent them from doing something particular, and you basically said, well, only a very stupid person would do that. So no. If they're so stupid they're going to do that, then I can't help them. All right, Gary, what's your position on this, the role of tools in all of this?
Well, there are good tools and better tools, I guess. I was trying to clear a storm drain that had a huge tree root in it, and I was using all sorts of tools I had in my garage. And, finally I just went to Home Depot and bought like the biggest roto-rooter machine they had. And that worked, and saved a lot of time. So, having a variety of tools, maybe, the more senior person, needs more raw power or more capability. The more junior person, maybe more training wheels. You start a kid on typically a bicycle with training wheels instead of giving them, the full, high-speed bike right away. So I think it's just sort of a gradual, revealing, is a good thing. Having, I argue with product managers about this all the time. You just use this tool about, 5 minutes to do a demo, right? But, our customers are spending their life in this tool,
Yes.
And so what looks like a cute little thing, becomes very tedious, if you have to repeat this animation,
yes, 4,750
every cell
yes.
of a 5,000 cell spreadsheet kind of thing, right? So
yes.
Yeah.
No, for sure. Right, Alan, I know you've worked on tools too. So what's your position on the appropriate nagginess of your tools?
Yeah. The trouble is, who's to say what's improper or bad? You can certainly
obviously. Right?
You can certainly say what's invalid, and a tool should not allow you to create invalid code. It certainly shouldn't allow you to publish invalid code to production. But when it comes to improper use, it's a bit more subtle. So for example, I would argue with Jan about whether it's sometimes useful to use other decision tables than unique. You know, there are certain things which might be considered bad practice that are actually occasionally really useful. What tools ought to do, though, is have a clear methodology behind them so that there is an accepted best practice way of using them. And the natural way of using the tool should be best practice. Basically, it should funnel you down what is naturally a good way to use the tool.
So if you don't want to do best practice, it should be less pleasant to use and more bulky under your hands, as they say. All right, okay. It's just like, so the horse, if you want to go where the horse wants to go, the horse is easy to ride. If you don't want to go where the horse wants to go, it's much less easy to ride. All right, Bob. Off mute. There we go.
I'm yeah, because I was drinking my coffee. I need it to keep awake. Well, I think actually that may be the bad stuff, the decaf. So I mean, I think that there are enormous difficulties in trying to build into tools good practice. I think that, and I mean, it depends on what you're using, but I mean, the thing is, if you're using something like Blaze Advisor, it's basically a programming language if you want it to be, and so you can do all the sorts of bad things you can do with programming languages. I mean, my very early experience in the kind of expert systems AI world back in 1989 was when one of my colleagues, who actually had been building rule-based systems for a while, came back complaining that the client had gone off taking his Prolog program and converted it into Fortran, but written in Prolog still, but it was basically now a Fortran program because it had got Fortran thinking in the way it was written. And you can, if you give a tool to somebody who wants to be, who is a Fortran programmer and still thinks Fortran programming, you can write Fortran in any tool if you want to, and so you have to. I think the thing is not trying to make the tool stop people from doing bad practice, but educating the users so they actually know what the tool is for and how to get the best benefit out of it. And so you shouldn't be selling, right. Yeah, you shouldn't be selling these tools to people without basically ensuring that they get trained and have that training heavily emphasizing what is good practice, how they should be using it. And then if they go away and do something stupid, then you've done the best that you can. I mean, you can't stop people from being stupid. People have tried to stop me being stupid lots and lots of times, and they've always failed.
As someone said, that the people who are trying to design things to be idiot-proof underestimate the ingenuity of idiots.
Indeed.
Yes. All right, Guilhem, you get to make what's your final thought here on tooling?
So I guess Dennis' question depends on whether you ask it to a developer or designer. If you ask a question to a developer of the tool, they're going to answer, well, the tool needs to be able to report X, Y, Z because there is this corner case, or I know this guy who does this, and it's in that situation, it's needed. There's no way to do without this feature, so let's put it in there. And also because we can, right? Or we can code it, so let's put it in there. Part of the engineer spirit. But the designer is going to say, hey, look, if you're adding more features just because you can, are you going to really help the users on board the tool? Because there's a question of reach. Education is good, but we also want to reach to a large number of people and make sure the tool is not intimidating, that people can adopt it easily, can onboard easily. So having the powerful feature is great, but let's hide them in a corner for those people who really want them and try to guide the users on a path that would work 90% of the time, would be easy. And it's kind of the trick, right? It's how do we make this tool accessible to actual people who don't care about the tool, they care about the business, right? Their business is not to write rules. Their business is to run an insurance company, to run a healthcare company, and the tool should not get in the way. The tool should help them. So it's quite important to build an experience that is going to guide them and maybe warn them, hey, you're going to paint yourself in a corner. Are you sure you want to do that?
So,
But
yeah.
yes, then I want the tool to support that scenario as well. I want to be warned, but I want the tool to support that scenario. But at least if I'm went there by mistake, I'm guided back to a
Right.
path that is safer, that the tool is going to help me, right? That is the whole point of building tools. Otherwise, hand out the code, right?
Just let them use
to make them
let them use VI, right? Yeah.
Right. And I want to add one thing though. I don't know if you spotted yesterday the presentation from Gregor about ML. We're getting into this scenario where we have ML more and more intermingled within the roles.
Mm-hmm.
This is adding yet another layer of complexity, of making the tool harder to use with a different data model, a different way of expressing things. So we throw a lot all of a sudden at our business people. So let's try to guide them onto paths that are relatively safe for their purpose. I think it's important. It's not easy, but it's important.
No, but it's important. All right, so we have a great question here from Professor Emeritus Van Thienen, who's also managed to retire, and Bob. He said, Jan says, we're a rather undiverse bunch of people. Almost all of us are in automation. And he hasn't heard very much about using decision management and human or manual decision making. So not everything has to be automated, and that he has experience of a lot of, in quotes, normal people. That means because we're not, just make sure we all understood that. Though people not like us, otherwise normal people, using decision modeling to just understand and explain their own decisions. And he's curious if any of us have experience in that area. And I want to sort of add to that. I would completely agree. We regularly find when we're building decision models that the folks who build them with us, even though there's no intent to automate some part of it, that they want to take those models and use them in training classes and go show them to people because they find it a very compelling way to represent how they make decisions. And a lot of the models we build have human and automated decisions mixed in the same models. And so I'm curious, does anybody else, some of us have more or less focus on working directly with customers here. Any other experience with that? Certainly, we find building non-executable decision models of people's decision-making tremendously powerful when we start thinking about where does the automation boundary fit? Where would we use machine learning? Can we standardize this at all? So yeah, I would be with Jan. This is a great use case for decision modeling. I'm curious if any of the rest of you have thoughts you want to add. I'm going to pick on Alan first because I know Alan.
Yeah, it's okay.
I'm talking. Yeah.
I'll have to be honest because I've only been involved in projects which involve some automation.
Some automation, right?
Yeah, but a lot of the task of analysis does involve modeling things which are not to be automated, especially where you have people involved in the process, and almost all automated processes have people involved in them. So you might have a number of automated stages, but there are still people there making decisions, dealing with customers, and deciding what the goals and details of the actual process are. So you've got that meta level as well.
Right.
I addressed this a couple of years back in a paper to this conference. I think CMMN helps a lot actually in describing the ways in which human involvement can be parceled up and controlled. And I do think it's very important that we start focusing more on the knowledge workers within organizations as a direct target of our systems. Once you have a set of knowledge encoded in some way, even if it's just the DRD, that is a very, very useful tool for people. Sure. And yeah, we need to think more in those terms when we're dealing with systems. We need to talk about total systems, not just the decision service.
Right. No, we find we've built a number of models where, they would define a decision model and they say, well, if it fails that, it just gets routed to someone. And we'd be like, well, why is it routed to someone? What is it you want them to decide? Okay, well, they have to decide this about it. Okay, so let's put that decision on the diagram. And how does that affect the decision making so that we can essentially feed that additional decision that they have to make manually back into the rest of the decision we're modeling? So it stops being an override and becomes part of the decision. And that, I'm completely with you, Alan. That conversation is, I think, where the next level of some of this automation is really going to come from in some of these companies. So you've got to figure that out. What do you really need them to do, and how does that fit into the overall decision? Anyone else? Want to tell us? Anyone else? Carlos, Bob, Guilhem, Gary?
Yeah, maybe just an additional detail on that is that in addition, it helps to build that data model that I was talking about earlier, because it builds that common lingo, that common understanding, even though you're not necessarily going to implement all of the rules and make that model executable, just defining it forces you to think about the words that needs to be used, their definition, and make sure that all stakeholders agree on that. So there's tremendous value, even as Alan said, if you just stop at the GRD, because you've already defined at least a good chunk of the data model and a common understanding of what the decisions that need to be taken and what do they need. So that it doesn't preclude you then to automate some of that into a second stage, right? It's always a good start, and maybe it's going to trigger interest into that second stage, even though the decision may stay manual for the moment. So I think there's value.
Yeah. I think that this is something which is possibly something one should have a conversation with from the business process side of things. I mean, someone like Denis might have useful insights on something like this, because obviously with business processes, incorporating manual tasks is something which is, you quite often see on the BPMN diagrams. And I mean, the closest I've kind of come to this was when I was working with the NHS blood and organ people and trying to figure out how we could improve the way that they were trying to allocate organs to potential transplant recipients, where we were sort of trying to automate the process that they have, which was horrendous. But there's a key decision which is made where you basically need to get in touch with the clinician who is responsible for the patients and ask them, do you want this kidney? Do you want this heart? They're sort of making a decision about, well, it sounds, I don't like this organ, it sounds a bit dodgy, or my patient is actually too sick for me to do the transplant. Right. So even I'd love to take it, but I can't. And those are sorts of decisions that are happening in there. But the way that we were looking at it was more from a business process perspective. I felt it was more kind of something which we should be using as kind of stateful decision service for it. But I was out argued.
No, we did a decision model once, but one of the decisions on the model was, does the patient look like they will survive surgery? And the IT guys were like, how are you going to automate that? I'm like, well, I'm not going to automate that. I'm going to ask the surgeon. And then they said, well, when wouldn't you just recommend what you can and let the surgeon decide to accept it or not? And before I could answer, the surgeon said, well, because sometimes surgery is still the best option. Even though I don't think you're going to survive it, the data says you're so sick that you're basically dying in front of me now. So, and so I don't want to override it, but I do want my opinion considered.
The operation was a success, but the patient died.
Yeah, exactly. I think to try to say a few words on this, James. I think the way what we see, at least I'm very biased, as a provider of decision management technology. Of course, my view is sort of biased here, but what we see mostly when humans are involved is actually case management. I wouldn't call that necessarily decision management. So the point many of you guys have made is, I would view it as essentially case management, either intervention or investigation case management, because the value that we bring as a platform to the table is agility, and humans are not agile. So at the end of the day, the problems that we end up being focused on are going to be problems that are highly automated, and case management tends to be the exception or the background processing, if you want, in the case of investigation. And the trend I've seen, and again, I may be wrong, but is that's actually the automation part is increasing, the case management part is increasing. And the big culprit of that is machine learning. It's that essentially they things that they cannot capture because the case manager cannot explain how they think easily. You cannot get them to necessarily build a decision model. It's a very long process. They actually can capture through the data and build a model for it. And what we've seen is essentially a decrease of the amount of things that get refer to manual processing, if you want, through case management by by taking more risk, thanks to the fact that you have more models out there.
Okay. All right. So another thread here. Let's do another one. So everybody asked one of Denise's questions. So I'll come back to Denise's second question in a second here. So Ron asks, a couple of interesting questions, right? That I thought I'll lump into one, right? So Ron's asking, if there was a clearer distinction between tools for business analysts versus tools that are for business analysts and programmers, would that change how people think about embedding best practices? And related to that, what do people see about trying to embed higher level knowledge macros, as Ron calls them, into tooling, right? To try and make it easier for people to do some of these things. So two topics there. Would dividing the tooling up into different role-based features make a difference to how mean and how hard-ass your tools should be? And secondly, what do you see happening in terms of up-leveling the capabilities of tools to sort of, do more of your thinking for you? Any thoughts from anybody?
Just a couple of quick
thoughts with that. So, sorry, Gary.
Alan, then Gary.
Okay, so I think we still do need a distinction between requirements modeling and design modeling, and the tools to support those two may well be slightly different. I can see a natural progression between a business analyst building a high-level decision model with the client, and then collecting rules as a separate endeavor to fill in the gaps which are provided by the business knowledge models, and then a design model which may not be identical to the one which was created in the requirement stage, but is more technically complicated or efficient, and which actually implements it in a good way. And I think our tools need to support that distinction, but in a way which
carefully
encourages the flow from one to the other.
Yeah, we do that a lot in projects. Yeah, that's very much we find exactly that. So I'm with you there, Alan, and indeed with Ron. I think there's a core set of DMN concepts that are very easy to get business analysts to understand, and then there's a more complicated set that are more about how you make the implementation work. They're different. Gary, you had something to say.
Oh, yeah, just the high versus the low. I think that's great as long as you don't have these cliffs, where you start off using the high level and then you reach the, end of your rope, sorry to mix the metaphors, and fall off the cliff. But if you can kind of, seamlessly or less seamfully switch over to the lower level tool without having to start over, that's very important. And then on the sort of the macros, I would say, yes, yes, yes. That's kind of how programming, in the open source world works today, right? There's a lot of agonizing over programming and, pro code or low code, but, pro coders don't actually write a lot of code sometimes, right? What they're doing is they're taking these open source frameworks, they're, heading over to, Stack Overflow or something, right? And getting like a little nice example place to start, and then they flesh it out, right? And they get a lot of community support, because of the open source is kind of like the, if you will, kind of the new standards community, right? So you're not in it alone. You're not in it, beholden to one company, one proprietary technology. You've got friends out there. So yeah, I think that's a very important trend to notice.
All right. Okay. Anybody else? Any other comments from the panel? No. All right. All right. So we're almost out of.
May I ask a question? I don't know how to.
Carlos, do you want to
no, go ahead, Jacob.
Jacob, go ahead.
I have a quite serious question, and it's related, James, to your book, what you wrote 15 with Neil Radin 15 years ago, right? Approximately. It was smart enough systems, right?
Right.
And that time, because you add this word enough, you actually set the bar for all of us a little bit lower, right? And what happened in the last 15 years, majority of, I think we succeeded to satisfy the majority of requirements that were in your system, in your book. And we built a lot of very useful, productive systems, and they are smart enough. And we have products today that they perfected what our main objectives to make, basically to make programming more easy for business people. And even if you don't tell that this is a programming, but what we have today, I believe we achieve certain plateau where we're not improving anymore because we're still doing, even if we don't accept this, instead of declarative, we do procedural, implementing procedural approach. We're forcing our customers to describe everything in rules, how to come up with decision. And I think it's time for us to raise this bar, initial bar, when we had the initial objective. Our business customer defines the problem, and our smart, not enough smart, but very smart decision engine solves the problems. And we certainly not there, but I think it requires a different approach than what we currently have, in spite of all our successes. So that's maybe you need to write another book. My question is that do you think it's smart enough is enough today, what was enough 15 years ago? And I'm not talking about machine learning.
So, I mean, so I would say that Neil and I picked smart enough with sort of malice, right? We were deliberately trying to say, you don't have to wait for AI to be smart, right? You can build smart enough systems that are useful now with technology that existed then and exists now, right? And that was business rules, optimization, predictive analytics, and data mining. And I think I would say that the vast majority of customers I speak to, that is still, in fact, what they need. Their use of AI outside of what I call interface AI for transcription, image recognition, video recognition is still overwhelmingly an abject failure. The vast majority of machine learning models built with intent to deploy still don't deploy. And it's because they won't invest the time and energy in thinking about what they actually need to do. And so we still need the people whose job it is to pay claims and underwrite loans to participate in this process. So for now, I think we have a long way to go before we're at the point where we can't do any more with the tools we have to hand. I think we have a great tool set that works and that is massively underused by the, as we lovingly call our customers, the big boring companies that are our customers. So that would be my 2 cents. I think
you're right, but I want to ask other experts.
Ask the others.
What right now I just we all have to drive cars, right? And we like to drive cars, but probably in 20 years we would not. I don't know exactly, but so I'm not talking about Holy Grail, you write definition and computer solves the problems. It's probably much further than 20 years, but still our objective should be different. We should minimize, it should not be 500,000 rules. It should be, and be forcing user to write them. User should define general environment and general constraints on our systems, and we should be offer user different solutions, or probably, and maybe like Alan described in conversation with the user, they can choose the best one, something like this. Or Jan today described how user creates one simple model, but we can interpret this model in 10 different ways based on availability of data. And similar problems, they are problems what we need to solve today. And if my question actually is, should not we raise the initial bar? That's what the question.
All right, so let's wrap up the panel with answers then. Let's go through everybody. Everyone gets a chance to answer. Carlos, go first.
Let me give you a quick thing on this one. I think the key problem here is not as much the number of rules that you're dealing with. Because again, when we said 500,000 rules in this example, it's actually 1.5 million. It's a huge number of rules, and you're not. It's not. There's no miracle in reducing that set. That's the individual pieces of logic that are involved in a complicated decision that involves all the major cities of the U.S. and the counties and the states and the world. I mean, you can't and the federal. can't really reduce that level of complexity. The major reduction in level of complexity is machine learning. It's the fact that, in fact, what is a machine learning model is nothing else than a very compressed set of rules. So the path to compressing these things is the path where things are not explainable, which is not the best approach. And we do have customers who will actually on purpose say, you know what, I prefer, give me an environment where it's actually efficient to manage this level of complexity in the rules, but I want them to be absolutely explicit. I want to be able to see what they are. I don't want to use a machine learning algorithm because I cannot explain necessarily what it is. It cannot go through legal compliance, etc. I think where the emphasis, where the effort, for our type of technology is to go, is again, sorry to repeat myself, but it has to do with not really that much the expressive power, whether it's declarative, imperative, whether it's graphical, non-graphical. All the tools do that. All the tools will make efforts there. We all try to incorporate things that are higher in terms of expressive power, etc. But the issue is in the end-to-end. It's ensuring that we do have an environment where we can do life cycle, or where we can do complete trace from beginning to end, where everything is understood, and where you have control on the business analyst. On there, I think the smart enough systems, I think they are smart enough. They could be better, of course, but they are smart enough. But then we're not necessarily yet at the point where we, let's say, completed the picture in that other dimension.
All right, Alan, why don't you answer Jacob's challenge? Jacob's challenge. I'm going to work through everybody.
Okay.
It's your last words of the panel.
Okay, I think the big thing which is going to make a huge difference to how smart our systems are is actually not so much the technical side. That's coming along nicely. We've got nice integration between rules and ML and all those things. I think it's to do with business enablement, and that business users should find it easy to create smart systems. I think this is going to be dependent on democratization of decision modeling, especially in terms of reuse and sharing of various parts of decision models. I think this may be more what Ron had in mind when he talked about knowledge macros, fragments of business knowledge that can be put together quickly and used easily through some sort of shared platform which allows an open market in business knowledge.
All right, Bob, what's your last comment for Jacob's question?
Well, I think that, what you were saying, James, I think is that there's still so much low-hanging fruit with regard to very straightforward decision systems based around fairly simple business rules, decision tables, a little bit of procedural logic, as supported by a lot of the decision management tools that are around. And I think that we're still seeing a lot of people are still kind of being blinded by the hype of machine learning, calling it AI. It seems to me it's very much like the expert systems bubble, of the early 90s. And I think that until we actually get people on board with the idea that they need to be able to manage their decisions in a kind of more organized sort of way, we don't need to, we need to kind of get over that hurdle before we're going to get to the point where people will start coming up with really challenging problems where we need to actually start changing our paradigms in terms of how we build these systems. What we have at the moment is good enough. The problem is that it's not been adopted enough by the people who really need to use it. And until that problem is solved, trying to build extra new technology. It's interesting to do, but it's not something, if we're not selling what we've got at the moment, these sophisticated things are not, and that, we'd be trying to solve problems that people haven't even realized they've got.
All right, Guilhem, where do you stand on this?
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. That is, and what you said earlier is that those systems are underutilized. So are they smart enough for today? Probably yes, but they are not used as much as they would, they should or would need to be used. So we need to work on as a community. We need to work on the next step. So by the time that the next demand comes in, we are ready for consumability, basically business consumability, to make sure that the decision can be more ubiquitous, can be everywhere in smaller snippet. It's not about collecting 1 million rules to solve a complex problem. That exists, of course, that's going to continue to exist, but it's also about the smaller decisions that are interspersed everywhere in a bunch of various processes or systems to increase the confidence of the business analyst that yes, they can step into those places and also define those smaller decisions by themselves with a tool that is easy to consume, less intimidating, so it can be spread to more usage than what it is used for today. So that links exactly to what Bob was saying. I mean, today's tools are smart enough probably, but we need to work on the next generation. We need to work on making them more accessible to a wider range of users that are not scared about using those tools.
All right, so, Gary, foolishly, I am giving you the last word.
The last word. I'm going to actually answer a slightly different question, I'm afraid.
Of course.
And the answer is no. So let me give you the question. And the question is,
this is why questions are so important in decision makers, right? Because just knowing the answer really doesn't get you there.
Will, programming in first order logic or decision rules or constraint programming or data science be a good solution for the low no code user? And you already heard my answer. I think it's no. So, I think, yeah, we would like to have smarter systems, but we're also going to have smarter developers. And, that's the balance right now, right? Is people want, more commodity developers. And, I think there's a limit as to how smart your systems can be. And I agree with James. The best, successes that I've seen and people see are, the smart document, scanners and the chatbots, right? Those are the two biggies.
All right. Well, I think we are 10 minutes over. I think that's quite enough for everybody. So I'd like to thank Gary, Guilhem, Bob, Carlos, Alan for your time. Hopefully everybody found those questions helpful. It's always fun to have this crowd on there. Jacob, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Great panel. Thank you.
Again.
Thanks.
Thank you.
See you next
time. All right, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.